Sure. And something about getting it. I got it.
All right, Bernie. Um, when did you get your orders to go to Vietnam?
I got my orders in March of '67, and then I had to go through training. They said everybody going to Vietnam had to spend another month going through, or 3 or 4 weeks. I can't remember now. In preparation, training, and those kind of things. Plus, I had to go through a 1 week combat correspondent course that was being put together because they had found that there was no way of the Information Services branch, which was ISO, weren't they didn't have a good handle on who was reporting where and where it was all coming from. So I finally got to Vietnam about the 2nd of May, if I remember it correctly.
Well,
But
and
I
to ask this question, what was the 1 week course for a combat correspondent? What did you do in that week?
Well, in that week they had it was organized by this master chief who had been over with the original, landed with the crew in March of '65. And when he came home, he said that, the reporters weren't being prepared in any way on how to, first of all, how to collect data, how to submit data, where it went, and radio operations. And it was just basically a Marine Corps. And I was in the first course. So they were experimenting with what materials did we need to know. Well, they gave us a little translation book. They gave us brought in a couple of correspondents from the first wave in Vietnam, and they talked about their experiences and how they connected with people and how they submitted stories. And so that was their attempt at preparing us for it. Well, when we get there, most of it falls apart because uh, it was written at a staff level, and we were anything but staff. Uh, so it was useful information, but it sure didn't take a week to spend on it. It was just another week delay getting there.
Now, whenever you got your orders and after the course, did you get any leave to go home before finally going to Vietnam?
Well, my wife was pregnant, and yeah, I got what I get. I got a week off before I had to get on. A week after I finished the course, they gave us a week to get, and then and at the end of the week, I was on a draft. When we flew, fortunately, we didn't have to take one of those old rust buckets, so we flew into Da Nang, uh, and that was so I had 1 week. Plus, on the weekends when I was going through infantry training, I could go home on weekends to my wife, and so. But that was it.
Now, how far along was your wife in the pregnancy at this time?
Well, she was pregnant about 3 months. Well, no, let me take that back. No, it was about 6 months. Because
And go ahead.
I was over. My daughter was born in June, and so I was in a little late uh, in getting there. But there's a long story I could tell you, but I won't. I wasn't supposed to go to Vietnam. I was supposed to go to Okinawa camp and Camp Stevens there, and I was supposed to be signed there for 13 months. Well, upon check-in, they found out they needed my MOS. They'd sent out a requirement saying anybody finds somebody in a draft, send them down, and that's how I got that's how I ended up not going to Okinawa as planned.
Now,
But
did you know that prior to the plane ride, or was that something you found out when you arrived in
well,
Okinawa?
it was Okinawa when I was trying to check in at Smedley D. Butler, and well, I'll just tell you the short story of it is I came in and they had orders for me to be sent down to Okinawa to the information ISO office down there, and so they put me on a truck from Kadena and sent me down to Camp Smedley D. Butler, and I dragging my sea bag, trying to look somewhat like, I'm presentable. after a long plane ride and a couple of days sleeping out in the benches. And I get there and I walk in and I see that there's the ISO office, and I knew two people that were there that I'd been with in El Toro. I stopped in to see them and say hello, and I said I've got to go check in. And I went to where they said check in. Well, it was noon, and the clerk that did the checking in was at lunch. And so I just saw an officer sitting there, a major, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, I'm supposed to sign in here. Someone be checked in." And he said, "Oh, well," he said, my corporal is at lunch at Chow." He said, "Let me see what you got there." And I gave him my shipping orders. And he said, "So you're supposed to be here at Smedley D. Butler." And I said, "Yes, sir, for 18 months. Yes, sir." He said, "That's an unaccompanied tour. Where's your wife and daughter?" I said, "They're back in the States." I didn't have a daughter at that time, but my wife. So anyway, the long story short, he looked at my orders and he said, "What's your MOS?" And I said, "It's 4312." He said, "That's informational service officers, people who are across the hall from me, right?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Let me see. There was something we had that came out of our request from Da Nang about anybody that finds a anybody in the 4300 field, tag them and send them down to First Division in Da Nang." And I said, "Well, what?" And he said, "Are you a sole surviving son?" I said, "No." He said, "Are you the care and parents for you taking care of your parents, responsible for your parents?" I said, "No." And he said, "Is there any reason you can't go to Vietnam?" And I said, "I got a wife and a baby on the way." He said, "So do a lot of them." And the next thing I know, he's got me signed up for transfer orders down to Da Nang. I get my orders typed up in that afternoon, and that evening I was put on a plane for Vietnam.
Well, what was the feeling like you had knowing that your orders changed just like that?
In a way, I wasn't upset because I really didn't want to go. I did not want to go to Okinawa for 18 months and unaccompanied tour. I didn't really want to do that. In fact, I had kind of been the group I worked with at El Toro. Half of them went to Da Nang, and the other half went to north up in the third division. And so here I was being stuck in Okinawa. So I wasn't upset about it because I had wanted to go to Vietnam. I had wanted to go there with the ISO. So I was a little chagrined, and knowing I was going to have to explain it to my wife. But anyway, I wasn't objecting to it. I kind of thought this is where I wanted to be anyway.
Now, knowing that that's where you wanted to be in itself and or getting to Da Nang, what was that first impression of Vietnam like when you step off into Da Nang?
Well, we flew in at night, of course, on an old Continental 707. And as we're coming in, we can see red tracers and green tracers along the hillside. So we knew that green tracers was not ours, it was theirs. So anyway, when we came in and they opened up that door, it was like opening up a door to a blast furnace. And of course, the real gauntlet was they unloaded us down one side of the strip of the airfield, and on the other side were all these guys that had been waiting to go home, and I was supposed to catch the flight up going back after 13 months, some of them 18 months. And of course, they all started in unison, "You'll be sorry. Your mother doesn't know where your ass is." And, they just, "You're nothing but fresh meat." It was just a whole gauntlet line. Of course, recognized what it was all about. They're going home and they're just trying to tell you you're going to have a whole lot of work here. So that was the first impression was guys are going home and I'm coming in and the fresh meat kind of concept.
So when you first got into Da Nang in itself, where did they send you next, being a part of ISL for First Mardev?
Well, the first I was sent to 1-7, 7th Marines, first Battalion, 7 Marines, which was that was after I had spent 10 days or 12 days uh, getting information, getting rolled in, getting assigned to where I was going to be. I was kind of filling in because I wasn't given any particular battalion, but I was told how to write stories, how to submit stories, and how to get them back to the ISO office in Da Nang.
Now, is that where
So
they gave you the press pass?
yes.
I'm going to pull that up real quick, if you don't mind. But you've got this nice photograph of this young-looking guy here. We've got you here. So, what was the purpose of the press pass?
Well, in theory, it was supposed to get us priority, and show us that we had reasons for being with Marines and right. And I had to provide it as a press pass to the who's ever commanding officer I was working with. But it was just basically something you showed. We found it to be useful when we went out to catch a ride on an airplane or a helicopter. Was we could show our press pass, and that was supposed to give us priority. So that was, it was a useful document in that you normally just waved it and said, "I'm with the press." And of course, half of them didn't know, they didn't see the Marine Corps part on it. They just saw press and they said, "Oh, okay, fine, get aboard. We'll drop you off where we're going."
Well, and then if I'm not mistaken, do you see the back of the pass right now?
I don't see it right now, but
All
I've
right.
seen it.
So the back of the pass, I'm going to pull it up for our viewers, as well. So what the back of the pass, describe it to me when I get it up here. What are we looking at here?
Well, it's in two languages. The first language that you see at the top is Chinese. The one at the bottom is Vietnamese. Now, why it was Chinese, I never could figure out. We used to joke about it, and that was when we finally run into the Chinese. We hold it over our head and yell, "Press, press." I did have somebody in one of the uh, South Vietnamese that we worked with. I had him decipher it for me one time, and it was something about this is a non-combatant gather of information and news, and is to be honored and provided for. If And that was basically what, it's a pass that says, "Hey, I'm supposed to be not shot, non-combatant. I don't get shot at." But of course, that was a joke because the first thing they gave you was a weapon. So it's like I'm going to say, "Let me shoot you, but you can't shoot me."
Now, when you finally went out for the first time with 1-7, and speaking of a weapon, what did you carry as a combat photographer?
Well, they initially I was issued an M14, and that's what I drug around on the first couple operations. And then I realized that I had guys in my outfit that had 45s, and they weren't carrying their M14s. And I said, "So how do you get a 45?" Well, we were correspondents were not registered to have 45s. Photographers had 45s, but reporters were not registered for 45s. And so I asked one of the guys, "How do you get a 45 if we're not authorized to have them?" He said, "First time you're on an operation out there, and the corpsman gets hurt or a radio man gets hurt," said, "be there to help them evacuate and keep their pistol." And so that's how I ended up with a 45. I took my 14 apart, turned it in, got a 16, took it apart, and left it in my footlocker. Because as I learned quickly, when I needed a rifle, there were a lot of them laying around.
Now, and we'll come back to that eventually on that last statement, but outside of the M14 weapon wise, how many cameras would you carry, or writing utensils would you take with you?
I'd carried two. Well, I carried one camera initially, and then I carried two, but I found out that the Nikonus, the supposedly underwater camera that would work, was was cracked, and so all the pictures I took from that one were abandoned. So I carried one. I bought it myself. I bought it at PX, because they wouldn't give me a camera because I wasn't in photo. I was in correspondent. So I went down and bought a Canon FX at the PX, and that's what I carried in the field. That's what I used when I took pictures for myself, and also stuff that I would, when I didn't have a photographer to work with me, I would take some pictures. And then when I got back to Da Nang, I'd give them to our top sergeant and tell him that, I've got pictures from the operation I was on, and he would take them down, and found out later that he would take them down to photo, and photo would take them, but they were somewhat jealous of the fact that we were out in the combat zone and taking pictures, which was their job. So on a few occasions, I saw pictures that were called U.S. Marine Corps official photography that I knew was mine. But since I didn't get a byline, I didn't get a reference line, and I didn't get anything. But and we all experienced that, all of us Snuffies. We had our cameras, and we would turn in film saying, well, this is one the operation, and we all had our own camera.
Well, and how many rolls of film would you carry with you on operations?
Well, I would carry it. We had those 35 millimeter tin camera. Those in the 35 millimeter came in from little round canisters, and so we would tape those to our camera around the neck roll guard, and I carried two around my neck, and I carried two in my pack, and they were all black and white 35 millimeter. Well, no, I take it back. I had one canister, which was mine. I bought it at the PX, and it was 35 millimeter slide color. And to get it developed, I'd buy a package. I developed prepaid. Kodak had this prepaid photo mailer, and so I could take my roll of 35 millimeter personal photographs, and I could buy this at the PX, and then I would mail it back to the States with my home address, and it would go back to Kodak. That was my return address, was my home address. But when I sent it to them, because I'd prepaid, they had to develop it and send it to my home address. So that's why I ended up with all of my 35 millimeter slides, because I was sending them home to be developed. I couldn't get them developed. I could not get them developed. The photo lab wouldn't develop my personal color ones, but I could sneak my black and white ones in once in a while.
Now, how many do you still have these 35 millimeter slides and photographs?
Oh yes.
How many pictures did you take with that?
Oh, there's probably a couple hundred,
Wow.
which are just sitting in my carousel slides. I don't know what else to do with them over the years. Well, let's see, there's one carousel that's 120, and then there's one that's 80. So it's somewhere in that neighborhood. Most of them are just, a lot of them are pictures from, some combat pictures. Some of them are just scenery pictures. Some of them are pictures of guys that I worked with and guys that were in my outfit. Um, so yeah, I still have those. I often thought about, I need to do something with them before they fade away. And I don't know my most likely my kids are not going to be that interested in having it. My grandkids aren't going to be interested. So I still have them somewhere.
That's
I still have
incredible.
them all. I still have them all in my 30, like I said, in my the old Kodak carousel. Uh, and I still have them in the closet.
Wow. Well, and we'll come back to some of the personal photographs, but outside of a weapon and your camera, what else would you carry in the field with you on operations?
Well, I would, first of all, I'd carry socks. That those were kind of a real necessity. I'd carry 6 packages of cigarettes. I carried a lot of that. If you could get to the PX, you could buy things like Vienna sausages and Ritz crackers. Mostly that kind of stuff, and I always carried an extra pair of glasses, which was necessary in my world. If I ever lost them, they have to hold on to somebody and figure out how to where I'm going to go. But I carried that. I carried food, carried sea rations. If we're going out on an operation, I had a couple cans of sea rations. I had some personal um, papers, not papers, but my press card and my travel orders. And the other thing we had was a set of repeat travel orders, which was another situation. I can send you a copy of those sometime anyway. They were ones that just amplified the press card saying, give this person and he's logistically trying to get to his assigned duty area. And so they could waive those, and anybody that said, well, what would authorize you to get on this plane? I got these set of repeat orders, you know. So between that and the press cards, we could travel. But I'm sorry, you asked, I forget what you asked, but that was, as I can remember, what was in my pack was mainly food and socks and a toothbrush. And that was pretty much other than the food items. If you get down to the PX and you load it up on food, and if you knew somebody at the CBs, you could probably get a couple fifths of something if you know how to do it, which was a matter of selling souvenirs to the CBs, and then the CBs would trade them for, I don't know, a pint of gin, whatever you need, whatever you could get.
Bernie, it sounds like you've had some experience trading for some fifths of things.
Yeah, yeah. It was that was the economy. The economy wasn't so much wrapped up in money in dollars or piastres. The economy was on what can you trade me? What do you got?
It's
You know,
fascinating.
and it was an economy. I've got Vienna sausages, and you've got a can of pound cake. I'll trade you Vienna sausages for pound cake. And I carried an extra notebook. I forgot about that.
Now, and speaking of some of your personal items that you carried, did you have a favorite sea ration or food item that you would try to take into the field with you?
Oh yeah, that was where the trading came in. Because as an attachment, my I was given the last choice because I wasn't part of the squad. It wasn't part of the, but they always let me have a sea ration. And my favorite was peaches and pound cake. They didn't come in the same unit, so you got the peaches in one B1, or you got your pound cake in B3. So you had to find somebody to trade. And of course, the new guys, they always got stuck with um, the new guys always got stuck with that Christmas thing, that roll kind of Christmas that comes up. Uh, that and ham and lima beans, better known as mothers and beans. Nobody wanted to trade for those. The fruit cake, that's what I was trying to think of, was fruit cake. They had a can of fruit cake, I mean, even fresh fruit cake is not a major settlement. They would give you this can of fruit cake. I guess their thinking was it would give us, extra food, extra sugar, extra, and of course, everybody would just offer to give you fruit cake for free. But my favorite was peaches. I got to be known pretty good in the outfit, as I would have my wife Carol at that time would send me Italian seasoning, lemon salt, send me uh, all kinds of spices. I had basil, I had tarragon, thyme. I had all these spices.
Oh, we've lost your audio there for a second, Bernie.
I cooked up a pretty mean bowl of uh, beans, of barbecue beans, and with my spice rack, and everybody would come by and say, "Have you got any of that Italian seasoning left?" So I had what's called the spice rack at one time.
That's definitely useful for trading though, and the
Oh
economy
yeah,
down there.
oh yeah, yeah. The economy was great. I'll tell you a story about trading sometime, but not now. But
Now, with your other personal items, with your helmet, did you write anything on your helmet? I know it was pretty common for some graffiti within the Marines. Did you do anything like that?
well, I had a helmet that had a hand-drawn black ace of spades that I drew and not very well, and then I had the other one that which was right across that said press, which I had taken off later because it was getting too confused between people wanting to know why I was still here. If I'm press, you're supposed to be gone. You only come in on a helicopter, get an interview, and then leave. Why? Who are you? So I took that off later. But mainly the thing I have the picture of my helmet there on one. I don't know if I sent it to you or not, but I'm standing there and it's identifiable because I had a black ace of spades, which was supposed to terrorize the VC, and it only encouraged them to be laughing at you. But
Now,
yeah, no, that's pretty much all I had on my helmet, really. Some guys, of course, had countdown calendars. Some of them had the name of their favorite sweetheart. Some of them had names where they were from. Some of them had cute little sayings like, well, we'll just assume those.
now, when did you finally go out on your first operation with 1-7?
I went out on Operation 1-7 in last part of May into what we called the Arizona Territory, and that was my first named operation, Operation Arizona. And I went out with them, and basically, I went with a photographer, and I went with a uh, radio interviewer, and we all pretty much gathered around. At that time, we didn't. I didn't know anything, so they said, "Well, we're going to stay with the command group." Well, means you were staying with the group that had all the command, and so therefore there weren't a whole lot of stories coming out from there. But we had an operation. I think it lasted 7 days. It's in my record book, Operation Arizona. And so I went out there and we did a search and destroy mission, and we actually found a couple of situations where the VC were waiting for us. And so we took some short fighting, but it was just mostly harassment fire. But I got a couple stories out of it. One of them I think I've included, uh, but I got a couple stories and went back to Nang, wrote the stories, and that was it was a little eventful in that I we saw a three VC group which were trying to set up an ambush, and the unit I was with, which was a Alpha Company, stumbled onto them, and there was a gunfight, and they finally took out all three of them. But that was the only, and we only had one minor casualty. So that was pretty much the whole story of that first trip. Seventh Marines were kind of a strange outfit. they were assigned they were assigned to the backside of the Marine base on at Da Nang, and so they were at the back, supposed to be the ones that were to watch for rockets and infiltration, but they were spread out so thin that there was it was a joke. And so, but I went down to Seventh Marines and went out on the operation with them.
Now, going out on the operation and those little sporadic but intense firefights, what was that like from your perspective, the first time being in combat with bullets flying?
It was it was exhilarating. It was scary because I didn't have any reference. I didn't, that first time out, and I wasn't with then. I was with the photographer, and I was with the radio guy, and they had different visions of what they were going to do. So Tony, who was a radio reporter, he was talking to the CP and the lieutenant colonel in charge of the 1-5, and I just kind of went up with a platoon to watch, to be part of the sweep, and taking some sniper fire, and we didn't really run into anything other than upset the ambush I spoke about. So it was kind of what we would call a long walk in the sun, in that we walked a lot and took a few sniper fires, and would dig in at night, and stand guard, stand watch, but nobody tried to infiltrate. It was probably the best operation to go on, because I learned how to observe what they were, how a combat team worked. From platoon to squad to fire team. I could see that there was a structure in among the enlisted, and I could tell that the senior people were in the right place. They were squad leaders, and I observed that what it took to be a combat marine, you were kind of thrown into it. If you were, just in my case, I was thrown in. I wasn't thrown into battle. I was sent down to go with one. But these guys did it, day after day after day. And when they got back for a little rest, it was just short, and then they go out again. And so I learned great admiration for small unit tactics.
Now,
And
being in proximity with small units, were any of these guys apprehensive about having you as a correspondent around? That you're not a part of their regular everyday norm, you're not in the fire teams or the squad. Were they apprehensive and nervous around you?
no, but I was told on several, numerous times, well, don't get in our way. You can go with us, but don't get in our way. In other words, your job is to stay out of our way. Let us operate the way you're not. And he said, if you get wounded, or if we get wounded, another person gets wounded, you're going to have to take your own best choice of getting well, to getting medevac. We'll take care of you, but don't get in our way. And I learned that made I could go out with any platoon, I could go out with any squad, but the understanding was that I was there to provide fire if necessary, and to not get in their way. Which you walk into an outfit like a squad, which is 9 members plus a corpsman, and uh, these guys are tight. They live together. They go through every day, and so as an outsider, or as we say, an attachment, uh, they're kind of suspicious of what where you've been. You don't have a reputation with them. That was why if you had longevity with a company or a platoon, as time went on, they could judge your action in the field and determine that you were savvy enough that you could be in their unit without causing distraction. And of course, there was always a question: is why in the hell are you here? What? You mean you came out here? Nobody would sent you. You're out here. Why? Well, you tried to explain, and then eventually, once you started having uh, Sea Tagger, the newspaper, once you started having stories in there and stories about them, you were pretty well accepted back in the unit. As I told people, when one of my favorite companies was Echo Company 2-1, of course. After I'd traveled with them, and gone several operations with them, yeah, they would send down a messenger to get me and tell me that we're getting ready to go on an operation. Captain wants you to know we're leaving at 0600 tomorrow. He wants you to know if you come along if you want. So that was pretty much a seal of acceptance.
Well, and speaking of what leads to that seal of acceptance with Echo 2-1, what kind of stories were you supposed to be gathering as a correspondent?
Well, this kind of stories is probably best described by our old Master Gunnery Sergeant Top Wilson, whom I sent you a bit about. Top's answer was that our story is not to cover the big battle. to cover the operation. Our job is to talk about the PFC from Kenosha, Washington, Kenosha, with an M16 rifle and what he does to survive or how he does in combat. And so your story is to write about that PFC. And hopefully the system is such that you write the story, it gets all gathered in the combat correspondence issue back at Denang. And then in theory, somebody sends a copy of that story to the kid's hometown. That's why all my notebooks will say, Lieutenant Chauffeur from Cleveland, Ohio, age 23. And then I have the address. And that was all because the supposed theory of the whole combat journalism thing was to write a story that got sent home to the kid's hometown paper. And it did. Probably one of the best memories I have is feeling a sense of satisfaction was I wrote the story about this one Marine who accidentally walked over a pit and fell into a mine factory. It was covered over and he fell into the mine factory and got out real. But I wrote a story about him and his squad finding this underground weapons, where they were making booby traps. And it was just a nice kind of story. The kid, I asked him a few things about how to feel like falling in, and I had observed it because I was with the squad when this happened. And so about 2 weeks or 2 months later, I'm working with the unit again, and the kid comes up to me and says, "Hey, storyteller, you got me in a blanky blank, a lot of work, trouble back home." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, my mother, they sent the story to my hometown paper, and they ran the story." And he says, "Now I got all these people wanting me to buy drinks down at the VFW when I get home." He said, and I said, "What more could you ask for?" He said, "Should have told my mother before it got printed." But that was a compliment of the work. I mean, that's when if the pure system of marine information, his job, it was set up to where the stories we wrote appeared in the Sea Tiger, or we had several guys had stuff in that came out in the Pacific Stars and Stripes. But the objective was to get that story to the kid's hometown paper. Now, whether they reused it or not was nothing we could control. But by sending that story to the kid's hometown paper, and it happened on several occasions where they'd say, "Yeah, they ran that story in my hometown paper." That was basically I think, the pure idea of how the system was supposed to work. Why did you have combat correspondence that's going out with units? Well, it was to get stories. And as you can well understand, if you were sitting back in the battalion after the couple of companies came back after 8 or 9 days out on patrol and operations, and you walked up to the guys and said, "Well, I understand you guys hit the shit out there. Anybody got a story I can tell?" The answer is going to be, if you want to know, come on with us. If you're sitting there clean shaven, fresh clothes, and you want to talk to these guys after they've come back out of the field, and you're wanting them to tell you their story, it's not going to work as well because they're not going to be. They don't have a reason to. Once you get where you're recognized, the unit, and the unit knows you, then it works. The system works the way it's supposed to.
And the unit you built that connection with is Echo 2-1.
Yes, that was the company. All the way from June to October, I covered mostly Second Battalion, but mostly when I could, I'd go with Echo because Echo was they prided themselves in being the point company. So that was a good outfit, and
Now,
they treated me well.
and before we get to Echo, this Operation Arizona, when you were with 1-7, did you have to use your weapon this first operation out, or was it tame enough to where you could record the stories?
I didn't have to, I had it ready, but again, I didn't get in the way of the platoons. I didn't get in the way of the squads. So I was there and I could represent, having a weapon. But as I recall, that particular operation, I didn't have to fire it. I was still carrying an M14 by that time.
Now, did any of those stories from that first operation make it into Sea Tiger or Leatherneck or anything?
One of them made it in Sea Tiger. I think I sent it to you, but maybe I didn't. I can go find. I had one story. I can't remember it right at the moment, but I came back. I had at least two stories, and I wrote both of them up. One of them got picked up. I have a copy of it in the Arizona territory. I'd have to look for it, but I can find it.
Well, I've definitely got some of the ones from Echo 2-1 and of course Way City that we'll get to here in a little bit. But when you came back from that first operation, did you immediately go out with Echo Company, or did you have some time to relax and write your stories out? What was the process there?
Well, the process was, as I soon found out, once you were assigned to an out to a battalion or wherever you were assigned, uh, basically you stayed with that outfit. Well, if you came back in to Da Nang, all you did was come in to write your stories, and you came in to get paid because most of the time, monthly, we finally got a system where we all agreed to come in on the 5 days before the end of the month. We'd all circulate back to Da Nang because one is we never got our mail because they didn't know where we were. You'd have a month's worth of mail. And the second thing was you had to sign for your check. And even though you probably didn't get anything, that we had to sign saying you were paid. And so most of the allotments went home. But so normally what you do is us Snuffies, we made it a point of coming in at the end of the month for 2 or 3 days, write the stories, get get a little happy, and but you didn't want to stay in Da Nang because if you stayed Da Nang, the staff screwed with you. If you just wrote your stories, had a couple of days rest, and you then got back out the field, you were good. Otherwise, if you hung around and did nothing, they'd find things for you to do, like burn shitters or
Now,
stay. Yeah.
you mentioned the burning the shitters. What else would they try to find for you to do just so staff could mess with you?
Oh, they put you on mess duty. Somebody would say, "Well, we need somebody on mess duty." Well, they go through the comb through the files and they come up and say, "Okay, we need somebody out of the combat correspondence issue, out of the unit. They don't have anybody. We'll get one from them." So they send up requests for duty, and then if you were in the hang, they'd put you on night watch. You'd have to sit out in the bunkers or staring in the dark, and they'd have you down, taking vehicles down and having them washed up and serviced and cleaned. There was all kinds of shit. And as time went on and you got smarter, you realized that Da Nang was nowhere except 3 days and then get the hell back out. You were better in the field than you were in the rear.
Well, speaking of that, you guys definitely had time to come together, and that's where we get to see this famous photograph. Well, I think it's famous personally, myself. Let me go back to it. Oh, I've lost it now. There we go. So the Snuffies, where does the name Snuffy come from?
Well, Snuffy comes from. There's two stories of that. One is uh, there was an Al Cap guy. Al Cap was a cartoonist, and Al Cap did I forget the name of the comic strip now, but he had one guy in there that was called Snuffy, and so that was one story. So we took up the name Snuffy and drew a character. The other story was the you figured it out. Once we figured it out was if you were E5 and below, sergeant and below, you were going to be sent to the field and you were going to be out on the operations. And the reason they sent you is because if you were staff, you were too valuable to the organization. But if you were just a sergeant or a corporal or lance corporal, well, they could do without you. And so somewhere along the way, the term came, we're just snuffies. Well, they're going to snuff us out whenever they can.
Now, in this famous photograph, where are you located?
I'm on the far right with a can of beer in my hand and no shirt, pair of glasses. That's
And where's this photograph taken at?
taken at the this CB's base, which was they had a CB R&R actually. It was where you could go and have picnics. It was on the CB's lot and right down by the water, and it was a safe harbor. And so this was taken in June when we had a full contingent pretty much of Snuffies. Uh, we only had about two. There were two staff and two officers, three staff and three officers in the group. The rest of us were just Snuffies, mostly identifiable by not wearing a shirt.
Now, who's all in this photograph that you remember?
Well, I remember everybody.
Good.
Um, Back behind me is our captain at that time, old officer in charge by the name of Hudson. He was a very good CO. He was actually a pilot and he flew observation helicopters. And, those things were a target. And he flew observation car for 6 months, got a Purple Heart. And the rotation for helicopters officers were 6 months. So after 6 months, they had to post you somewhere and they needed a captain in charge of the ISO. So they sent him down. And he was a cool guy because he didn't mess with us and he didn't let the staff mess with us much. And he was perfectly happy to let the staff run the organization. And every evening he'd check out the Jeep that we had, and he'd go down to the Navy. The Navy had a big organization. They had a place called the White Elephant, and that was where the staff or the officers would hang out. And he'd go down. He was a hell of a card player, and he would go down and play all night long down there at the White Elephant. And come back up the road about dawn with the Jeep, and then check in with us and see how things were going, and then he'd go back to take a rest. He was a good man. The one that's behind him is Lieutenant Tyler. Lieutenant Tyler was a real case of work. He didn't know anything about journalism. He didn't know anything about writing, but they stuck him out there, and so he would occasionally decide to pick on somebody's story, and tell us how badly it was written and why didn't we do this, why did we do that. But he mostly was, it was only on days that he decided he had to be commanding that he'd, try to get horse's ass about things. The other guy that's standing next to him, that's, uh, which would be top row, second from right, he was staff sergeant Jensen. He was okay, but he was still just one of those guys that didn't go to the field, but he would sit back there. I don't know. We always wondered what they do other than going down, take the Jeep and take everybody down to the mess hall, which was just 50 yards from where we were. And then after they had their chow, somebody had to take them back down to their barracks so they could take a nap. That was another reason why you didn't stay in Da Nang any longer than you had to. They'd have you drive the Jeep full of them down for chow. Anyway, that was TD Stevens. The other guy is um, Staff Sergeant. I knew I'd miss one of them. Anyway, he was okay. George Selby, the guy on the in the background without a shirt, right there. Yeah, that's George. That's George. He was uh, my sergeant in charge of me when I was sent to one. He was the regimental First Marine Regiment. George was the what they call press information officer for that regiment. Well, the regiment included 2-1, which was Second Battalion, First Marines. And so George was always supposed to look at my copy, but he said, just go file it. Don't worry about it. They'll care. It'll be okay. And he said, next time you go, George hated going back to the staff. He was just really did not want to spend any time with the staff. He disliked them just thoroughly because of what the way they were. Uh, but George was a good man, staff sergeant. Bill Hamer standing in front there with the Coca-Cola can. Bill was one of us, but he stayed. He was named copy editor, so he stayed in the rear most all the time. Standing next to him was my good friend Gordon Fowler. Gordon, if you can see around the neck, he when this was taken, he just gotten wounded on Union, and you can see the bandage is still on his neck. Uh, LT Brown is the next guy over with the shirt with no shirt. LT Brown was a really strange guy. He liked going out with artillery units, and so he was pretty much assigned. He just went wherever the utility or the uh, fire batteries were. In other words, he went with the artillery. Two guys standing back of him are lifers. Uh, with a white shirt on is Stevens, and next to him is I said I wouldn't forget. Anyway, they were both staff, and they stayed back in the rear and did things like screw around with our copy. Uh, the guy down below with the utility shirt on and the beer can is my old friend Dave Martinez. He and I were at El Toro together before he showed up about 3 months after I'd been in Vietnam, or 2 months after I'd been in. The next one over next to them is Tony LaBella, the famous voice of Tony Rose, NBC. He was our radio guy. Tony was harmless. Next to him is a guy by the name of Bob Killen from Hungry Horse, Montana. Bob was assigned to 5th Marines, and he worked out there. The guy next to him is Mike Stokey. Mike was assigned to first 1-5 and did a good job. Joe Girardi was an interesting individual. Joe had been in the Peace Corps in the Philippines for a couple of years before he I'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, Joe was a good man. Lonnie Carson's the guy with the white headband and the black shirt. He and I had been in El Toro together before he shipped over and came to Vietnam a few months ahead of me. Uh, and the guy lying down, is, we called him Duke of Dialogue. His name was Duke Huntington, I think. Well, Duke was a character that probably could have gotten shot if he hadn't. But he was the kind of guy that would lie, steal, and cheat, and he convinced Top Wilson that he was a writer. So Top brought him in and tried to give him a trial to see if he could write. And Duke would go down to a place called Dialogue, which was an old French fort, and that's where he stayed all the time. Was down in Dialogue, so he became known as the Duke of Dialogue. He interestingly story. He actually he got kicked out uh, not too long after this picture was taken. He had been lying and conniving with the chaplain's office, and he got caught, uh, borrowing money from officers. And, hey, he was a mess. He was a mess. The story was he kept extending because I saw him in December. He kept extending even though he was sent back to the infantry where he came from because he didn't want to go back to the to Oceanside, which was outside of Camp Pendleton, because there were charges pending on him. Apparently messing with some women. But he was something else. We were all glad to see him go because he was just a big terror, and he didn't belong with us. Interestingly, what did belong with us, and I this may have been mentioned before, but our MOS, military occupation specialty, our MOS 4300 was an area where we had all the washouts, officer OCS washouts. In other words, if you were OC a washout, uh, and you didn't get picked up your promotion your bars, they had to send you somewhere because you were still obligated to have a 3-year term, even though you flunked out of officer candidate school. So we were the landing ground for a lot of these guys that had been officer candidates. The idea was, well, so many of them were college graduates or college kind of people. They thought, well, at least they know how to type. Maybe they know how to write. Well, it turned out we had a great team of writers that was productive and good, well known. Went on to civilian occupations with newsmen, uh, but that was we had a number of people that were officer candidate washouts, and that was because they sent them over to us because you know they can type, they can write, they got a college degree or you know. So anyway, that's the story of that bunch.
Now, shortly after this photograph is taken, that's when you officially go out with Echo 21 for that operation that seals the fate for you and Echo Company, correct?
Yes,
Now, what was this operation you went out on with Echo Company?
Calhoun, Operation Calhoun, June. I've got the copy. It's late June. It was going to be a big battalion operation sweeping through this valley. There were so many valleys in Vietnam, particularly. All the mountain streams and valleys ran down into the sea shore area, which is so you had sand and no rice paddies in the north, but you had rice paddies south of Da Nang, and the terrain was entirely different. You had to go into the jungle to try and find anything, to search and destroy. So Calhoun was set up to be a three company pincer movement to cut off this one supply trail that ran into the jungle and went in towards Laos. And so Echo Company was chosen to be the point company, and Captain Pratt, who was a wonderful, tremendous officer, decided that we would all go quick and silent. In other words, we didn't have track jackets, we didn't have helmets, and we were left at night in the middle of the night. We started moving to get into our position at daylight. We were supposed to be on top of this mountain, or not mountain, but the top of this hill, so we could observe everything going down in the valley. And in the event if we flushed a bunch of them out, they'd come our way, and we could see them and call in artillery. That was the theory. And what happened was we were going through this, walking at night, traveling at night through the couple of villages, and we tripped the first ones, and from then on, every hour on the hour for the next 5 hours or 4 hours, they would ambush us, and so we took several casualties. That was probably the first time that I had gotten shrapnel in my leg from being. They would throw hand grenades at us, and they'd fire a couple of rounds, but we kept moving, and that was the story. I still wrote the story about moving hour every hour, uh, ambush every hour. And that was my first operation with Echo 21. And I got to know him, the unit, and they got to know me. And of course, I stayed. The next time I did a couple operations in July, Operation Pig, uh, Operation, sorry to be blank at the moment, Operation Pike. And then there was another one, I can't remember her name right now, but I did 3 more operations with them. And that pretty much cemented my association with Echo. Pratt was a very pragmatic officer. He believed that your job was to be out there as long as you could and patrolling your technical area of responsibility, which meant every 3 days you sent another platoon out to search your chosen area of responsibility. And so Echo was always going somewhere. Fox brought Fox and Gulf with the other 2 companies. They weren't ambitious. They'd wait for the assignment not and take it as they got it. Pratt was the leader. He was definitely the leader of the whole company.
Now
Or
on this operation, being that you were wounded, of course, by shrapnel, and especially with a hand grenade, is that the first time you fired your weapon in combat?
I didn't fire that night. When we got up to the ridge and we saw a number of in BC, it was mostly BC because we're south of Da Nang. We saw a group of about 10 of them trying to get out of the valley. And of course, we just called artillery on it. I saw a sniper track down what he thought was an unfriendly black pajamas, black hat, whole thing, and they sniped at him. I didn't have to. There wasn't any real attempt at trying to find us and overrun us because we were too well sealed and up on the top of this ridge. So there was no combat for us. We were pretty much stood by. And I've got a couple stories. One was it was on that operation that one of the Marines got bit by what they believed was a snake, and it was in the middle of the night, and we had to bring in a helicopter to medevac him, and it was such a strong, rocky point that they actually had to this day they should have given that pilot a medal. He dropped, it was a CH-47 tail dragger, and he the to get the guy medevaced, he had to bring in, and he actually had to lower the ramp and back it slowly into this flat rock where they could then get the Marine onto the chopper. And I mean, it was in the middle of the night, it was rain, and he brought the thing right in and dropped the tail down enough that you could run it. So that was an interesting observation. Did write a story about that. Uh, Trying to remember if I wrote another one or not.
Well, I
Uh,
do have one of your stories I was going to bring up here for today. That was written about, of course, on this operation with Echo 21, and these 2 squad leaders that just finished their tour in July.
yeah, yeah,
Now,
McGovern and uh, Brooks from Philadelphia. Yeah, yeah,
so
remember him well.
can you tell me about this little segment? What you remember about this story that you wrote?
Well, we were on a I mentioned it earlier. When you had a battalion area like we did, which was south of Nang, you had what was called TOR, and Tactical Area of Operation. Uh, and that was a way of patrolling around and making sure that nothing was happening, to no attempts to try and get into your battalion headquarters because you had Marines always patrolling. And so we would patrol platoon size, 2 platoons sometimes. We would patrol for 3 or 4 days, and then we'd come back in, and then another platoon would go back out and patrol again. So there was constant patrols going out around our battalion area, and that was what these guys were doing at the time. We were going down to sweep through a ville, which we had been knew that was unfriendly. It was pretty much occupied BC, and so they were sweeping through, and they took some fire, and they set up a boundary, and Brooks was in charge of one platoon, and Governor was in charge with another platoon. Or I should say squad. Excuse me, squads. They were two squads under the first platoon, and they went down and drew some fire, and they fired back, and then one of the Vietnamese would work with us. Sometimes they'd have rangers that would work with us, and apparently during the process, one of the South Vietnamese was wounded, and so in setting up LZ to try and get him evacuated, they took more fire, and that was when these two guys decided to take their squads and go around and to try and outflank the village, which is of course surrounded by bamboo and brush and trees, and so they had to just basically drag their drag themselves through all the brush to get there. That's what I remember. I was there, but I wasn't involved with the operation. I saw the two of them going out with their platoons or their squads. That's what I remember.
Now, asking you a quick personal question with how this story's written, do you think that if the Marine Corps did a Sea Tiger today, that they would allow stories like this to talk about the openness of killing and in combat?
No, no, in fact, there's one story I wrote. I think it was one about get ambushed down the hour. I I wrote down that the point Marine was killed, and that came out in the story. I didn't name him, but I still said that, we killed three VC, and one our point man was killed on the last ambush. Well, there's no way that now that they would allow you to write about Marines being killed, and that was you wouldn't be able to say, well, we killed five of these or we killed six of those, or that nowadays you wouldn't do what we were doing in those days were body counts. Saigon wanted to know what the body count was, and so you had to, we could we never got we got told not to identify Marines being killed. That was later on. But we were never told that you couldn't put down the number of deaths or KIAs or anything. So no, they wouldn't. In this day and age, they would not allow that. They would say that they were something a little more civilized, I guess, or a little more pure, and say that there were a number of insurgents that were encountered.
Well, and speaking of the fighting, of course, the combat, you writing stories about combat. What's the feeling like? What's the emotions like being around this? You're seeing death, you're smelling the gunpowder, you're witnessing it. What's the thought process? What impacts you there?
Thought process is I got to pay attention to what I'm doing and where I'm going and who I'm going with. I've got to take care of myself, and I got to take care of any fellow Marines that I can help. And after a while, I'll admit, you're scared all the time. Honestly, you're running on adrenaline. Uh, no, even if no contact, you're still running on adrenaline because you can be hit booby traps. You can, be found out. Uh, And so the issue was, yeah, after a while you become a little bit associated with death and gunfire and battle. Uh, but if you do get too accustomed to that, you kind of go nuts, and you finally have a breaking point. And I just held on to the fact that I was going to survive it, and I just knew that if I did what I was supposed to do, which was to take care of myself and take care of the Marines around me, then I was going to be okay, because they do the same for me, and they did.
Well, that's what I love truly talking about Marines and talking to Marines that were there is the camaraderie formed regardless of who you were still a Marine.
Mhm.
Now, did any of the ISO guys reach that breaking point while you were there where you noticed that something changed about them and that they had seemed like they were going crazy?
Well, we didn't have that. We had guys that it was determined that they'd been in the field long enough. We had one guy that just did not like to go in the field. He couldn't do it. They sent him out on a couple of operations, and he couldn't handle it. He had to get on the supply chopper and come back. And so, you know, he was not able to handle anything like that. I don't know. They said that he was on his first operation. People got wiped out, KIAs. I don't know what it was, but he uh, he spent his days working up there with the staff. He ran the jeep, he ran the patrol, the guy taking care of house mouse things. We called them house mouse. He just did the little jobs that needed to be done. And the idea was that his field time was up, and so he only had 2 months left to go when they finally decided to bring him in out of the field. And he'd been left out there too long. But nobody cracked up. We were all a little crazy anyway. I think all of us could at one time or another cracked up.
Well, the Snuffies are definitely a very unique aspect of the Marines in Vietnam that very few people truly know about. A very small knit group. And you're right, you do have to be a little crazy to take cameras and to take pen and notepads into a combat zone.
Right. I have a treat for you.
All right. Wow.
These are all my notebooks that I took field notes. These were the ones that all my stories were written on. And all the stories I can find the handwriting notes, and I can match them to some of the Sea Tiger stories.
Wow.
And these have been my personal treasure. The trouble is, I don't know whoever is going to value them. You know,
That's incredible. So what do you so have you ever thought about publishing this and putting it into a book? I mean, Bernie, you've got one hell of a story to tell from, you know, Echo 2-1 to Contien to Way City. I mean, you've seen aspects of the war that not a lot of Marines did.
yeah, that was one thing that could be said about all of us is we had more of a broad picture of what the war was all about because of the positions that we went. We traveled from different place to different place. Whereas if you were a grunt and you were told you had 13 months, you pretty much stayed with that company, that platoon, and you didn't see it as much as we did. You asked me about writing. I didn't write. I tried it. A couple of years after I got home, I tried to write a book, and it just got to be such a burden and such an effort and a mental gymnastics that I gave up ever trying to write a book. But I helped other people write their books. And the most recent one that I is written about the battle for Way City, and it's the most authority, and it's written by Mark Bowman, who's written numerous books. Uh, this one is pretty much my legacy of what I experienced in Battle for Way City, and he was kind enough to take a year in visit with me on several occasions, and I was able to sit down with him for several hours, a couple times a year, and anyway, it's a great book on Battle for Way City, and it's pretty much my story that he was willing to capture and put into the book. Uh, just just because I have to. Uh, he was kind enough to write in the. You have to find it to prove to you I have it. Anyway, he autographed it for me. He said to Steve, the storyteller, "I think you were my favorite interviewee in this book." That was quite an honor, I thought.
That's awesome, Bernie. I've actually got that book on my shelf. I've got that one, and then another one I used to talk about Way City. I'll need to see if you were mentioned in it. I know some of the other correspondents are, but it's Fire in the Streets by Eric Campbell. It was published in
Yeah,
the mid late 80s.
yeah, yeah. Fire in the Streets is a good one. There's the first one that came out was called Tet by Oberlin. That was way back in the early 70s. But you know, it as a fellow historian, you will probably find agreement with my opinion that if you want to write a true story of an event, you need to give it about 50 years between war, in particularly in wars. You have to wait for about 50 years to get unbiased and unbiased memory, unbiased reports. You know, somebody said once asked me, you know, when did I think that the Vietnam books, so the final book on Vietnam would be written? I said after the last VC, the last NBA, and the last Marine died, then they'll write the new. Then they'll write a new history. It can be
Well, it's like
first.
and to echo that, I've spent a lot of time interviewing Marines from 1-4 that spent up their tours along the DMZ in that area. And for some of the guys I've interviewed, they've told me that they want me to publish things, to write their stories, to release the audio, but once they're dead, because they don't want anything to be associated with them while they're living. And you're right. There's a lot of information out here that we historians have gathered that we can't release until, unfortunately, you guys are no longer with us.
Yeah, yeah, understand. And it's just a period. It's distance, time, and distance away from the event. The further you have distance and time, the more accurate interpretations you're going to see because the research documents are larger and longer and older. Uh, so it's a process. I like I said, as a historian, I realize that you to get to original sources, sometimes you have to remember the first original sources were closer to the event, and therefore the view or the opinion may be skewed because it was too fresh, it was too early in the program or too early in the process. That's
Or
just
you make a damn fine historian, I'll say that.
well, I'm glad to be in the company of you. Uh, I don't know if whatever else I can offer you. Um, you know, if you want, I know that your time, you get a tight time frame today, and if you wanted to talk again at your
Absolutely.
convenience,
My plan was to talk to you at the same time tomorrow.
well, tomorrow, let's see, that would be Tuesday. Yeah, that would probably be good.
All
I
right,
don't have
then.
much of a social life, but my social life depends on going to PT 3 times a week.